welcome everyone. Well, I'm glad to see some new faces here and some new names. And very much welcome to the second presentation in our new ISCIA Seminar series. What were we thinking? So today I'm very happy to introduce you to Emma Hay, who is a postdoc with the ISCIA chair working on ecological thinking and the overlap between environmental ethics, and how we understand ourselves as kind of subjects and as social beings. In her presentation, Emma will focus on Deleuze and Guattari's geophilosophy, from which we get the metaphor of the rhizome, which suggests connectivity and non-linear interrelations between many variables. So Emma sees this rhizomatics, which a term she coins, as a way of thinking that is much more suitable for a complex reality than the arborescent thinking that's still kind of dominates, I think, today. Arborescent thinking is based on the idea of a hierarchical and linear tree of knowledge, if you like, moving in one direction, kind of from roots through the trunk to branches and leaves. And as Emma says, Deleuze and Guattari are tired of trees. So it's kind of a sad metaphor, but they're tired of tree-like thinking, I think, yeah. They insist that we should stop believing in trees and roots and radicals, and they've made us suffer too much. So in other words, we need to move away from this kind of stiff hierarchical thinking and also potentially radical thinking, and perhaps look underground a little more for a metaphor for thinking, perhaps to the complex kind of mycelic networks that support the trees, the mushrooms, or to other rhizomes. Anyway, for more on this, over to you, Emma. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, thanks everyone for being here. Apologies for the slow start and my inability to work with technology, which is showing itself nicely right now. Okay, I'll share my screen, and then maybe Andrea, you can just let me know before you mute that you can see everything after our difficulties. So here we go. Sure. Okay, can we see?
We can see. Lovely.
Okay, and then I shall begin. Okay, so I would like to begin this talk with a short caveat, and that is to suggest that although this talk is about Deleuze and Guattari's concept of the rhizome and how it may be useful or what it may have to offer us in terms of the idea of the seminar, which is to consider, what are we thinking or what were we thinking? I would like everyone to know that I am by no means an expert. In fact, I don't think it'd be possible to be an expert on Deleuze and Guattari, really, in my sort of lifetime. So this is just really plucking certain concepts out of their vast oeuvre of interesting work and using this particular metaphor, this botanical metaphor of the rhizome, in order to sort of address some of the issues that I think are coming through this seminar series in terms of grappling with environmental crisis and indeed broader ecological or meta crises that's ongoing. So I've called it In the Garden with Deleuze and Guattari because I want to sort of reflect a little bit on some of how their work has helped me to understand my own direct experiences of what some philosophers call lived complexity, direct experiences of this notion of what complexity actually is. So I'm drawing from 1,000 Plateaus, which is a second volume of an enormous amount of work. The rest of it is Anti-Oedipus. And 1,000 Plateaus opens with this chapter 1, which is the rhizome, and that's what I'll be drawing from in a very sort of limited way for today. So to introduce, according to Deleuze and Guattari, they say a rhizome has no beginning or end. It's always in the middle. It's always intermezzo. And they contrast this or juxtapose this to another botanical metaphor, and that's the tree, which they say is entirely different in the sense that the tree imposes the verb to be, whereas the rhizome is about the conjunction or the prefix and. So immediately you get this contrast of, you get the botanical idea coming through, and then you get this contrast. There's this idea of a rhizome, and then there's this contrasting idea of a tree. So as I go through, I'll explain what these terms mean and how it is that they actually link. It's not the case that one is entirely separate from the other. In fact, you have rhizomes in trees and trees in rhizomes, as hopefully will become a little bit clearer as I go through the presentation. So when we talk about the rhizome and rhizomatics, what we're really doing is Deleuze and Guattari are using this particular botanical metaphor in multiple ways. They use it to denote a principle of connectivity. It's a way of thinking or a concept, a metaphor that expresses something which I would regard as ecological reality, the complexity of ecological reality. And the rhizome is used because if you think about, say, ginger or crouch grass or these kind of things, what botanical elements, what you find is there's a section that you can see that is above ground, that is visible. But then we know that underground is much more going on. So the rhizome has an outward stem that you can see, but at the same time, it's connected to a vast network of underground interactions that spread far and wide and that connect. So in terms of what it actually denotes as a botanical metaphor, there's some important elements that sort of try to suggest or show that everything is in some form or another interrelated and connected, and that you might find that although some things look like they're separate or that they don't have anything else going on, what you find underneath is that there's actually far more to it than that. So with Deleuze and Guattari's use of the rhizome, I like to think about this in terms of how it could connect to or how it can help us understand complexity science and modern day nonlinear dynamics. It's a way to think about it in a slightly unusual way that doesn't require necessarily you know, a lot of scientific knowledge, for example, and it helps us to sort of come to grips with a way of thinking that is perhaps difficult for us. One of the reasons for this is that rhizomatics or rhizome thinking in terms of interrelational interdependence is particularly difficult, whereas as a metaphor, this actually allows us to see how things that may seemingly discrete entities that don't seem like they're connected at all actually are indeed very much connected. And what this comes to do, as I'll try and show, is when juxtaposed to a different type of thinking, which they call arborescent or tree-like, we find that there is a contrast. We find that there is a dominant mode of thinking that does not necessarily reflect rhizomatics or the nature of interrelational connectivity. Now, there's more to the rhizome than this, but this is where I'm beginning, and I'll continue with what else there is shortly. And if you can hear dogs in the background, I'm sorry. It's a very noisy area. I hope it's not too loud. Okay, so where I live at Van Staden Scourge, I interact a lot with the environment around me. I'm outside a lot. I live a very off-grid life. I spend a lot of time in the garden. And one thing I began noticing very often is the absolute astonishing, beautiful fractals that exist in nature. So I was exposed to this through seeing ferns, seeing pine cones, the spirals in shells, the spirals that exist in various different types of plants that exist. And when I looked into this, when I started to look into, you know, why why did these attract me so much, these shapes? I found that actually fractals are very interesting in the sense that they give us an image of chaos. They show us what is referred to in complexity science as the order of chaos, if you like. So one thing about fractals is that although, one thing about fractals is the nature of them is that the entire image, so the entire fern leaf, you can find the shape or the similarity of that shape within every part of the leaf at every scale you look. So from the very minute up to the whole fern, the shape is replicated throughout. In one way, it's replicated in the sense that there is recursion or self-similarity. So this creates this sense of beauty and this incredible sort of what looks to the naked eye as uniformity. But what complexity shows us and what fractal science and chaos shows us is that although it seems like there is a continual recursion or self-similarity, there is actually at the same time always randomness built in. So within fractals in particular, what we find is that the replication that exists on every scale is also at the same time imbued with continuous randomness. There is a form of self-organization that recurs at the same time. So within fractals, we find the image of chaos because there's a paradox. And in the sense that there's the continuous replication of the same pattern or self-similarity, but at the same time, there is always at minute scales a form of heterogeneity or difference that exists. You might not see it to the naked eye, but we know that it's there. So this speaks to this idea of a both and sort of situation. You both have similarity, and then at the same time, you have this heterogeneity that exists within it that in some way also allows it to happen. So people will sometimes say, well, they may refer to Koch's snowflake, where we can create the pseudo fractals, if you like, using computing technology. But these fractals are pseudo in the sense that unlike nature's fractals or God's fractals or whatever you'd like to call them, they don't show any kind of self-organization or randomness because it's inputted. So it's pseudo randomness. So within the natural world, the self-organization and the emergence of unknown properties is not something that we can replicate using, well, I'm sure we'll get there, but we can't replicate it at the moment. So they're pseudo. So fractals give us this link, this visual link, or have given me a visual link into what sort of complexity actually means. Now, what's important about this is this nature of paradox and non-linear thinking. If there is self-emergence and if there is always randomness built into natural shapes, and I should also point out the fractals don't just exist in leaves and shells and whatnot. You can see them at various scales in terms of rivers, mountains, blood vessels, neural networks in the human brain, and all the way out to the whole entire galaxy. So everywhere, fractals as the image of chaos unite us in some form or another. Now, I'm using this to sort of link into the notion of the rhizome, or to express the rhizome, because Deleuze and Guattari say that the rhizome is not only something that is sort of bounded, like, so you can see, botanically speaking, you can see the rhizome emerging from the soil, you can see the stem, you can see the flower of the ginger, for example, on the stem, but we know that underneath there's also a connection to roots, to the soil, to the microbes, and the part of the rhizome that's sticking out is also obviously connected to the air and the moisture and to other animals, other insects, and so on. So there's absolute connectivity on one hand, but on the other hand, there's also individuality or a sense of boundedness or closing. So this links into complexity science too, because we have this opening that allows for exchange and processual sort of dynamic interaction, but there's also a continuous closing. Now, you might think to yourself, well, why does this matter? And what's this got to do with environmental crisis, or with what were we thinking, or with all the issues that we're facing in this seminar? Well, it has a lot to do with things. If you think about how it is that non-linearity does not seem to, or complexity thinking does not seem to fold through the way that we actually interact with the world, think about the world, and organize ourselves. When I talk about the entirety of humanity. So I am homogenizing us, but we tend to focus on things in a very different way to the rhizome. We tend to look at things as separate entities, individual, static, closed systems. Now, we know that the complexity paradigm is taking shape, but it's really not filtering through necessarily in many different ways. And Deleuze and Guattari are great at showing how this could be the case, because their notion of the rhizome is attached to an ontological project that is all about interrelationality, but also about recognizing the bounded or static nature of the individual entity. So instead of saying there is only flow, there is only process, or instead of saying there is only static entities, then it's more of a position of both and. So I'm going to try and explain what I mean by this and why it's important. In my own life, I've discovered working outside a lot and living in close connection with outdoor spaces and natural cycles and processes, that my own perception is very much framed, or not framed, my own way of thinking is very much dominated by linear, atomistic, separatist thinking. So when I first moved here, after planting a lot of trees, lots of indigenous trees, there was a major fire in 2017. It wiped out most of the plot that we live on. We beat the fire out and saved our small, humble cabin, but most of what we had planted and most of the canopy had gone. All the insects that I'd come to know and become very attached to, and all the processes were suddenly wiped out, and I felt very depressed. I felt like there'd been a destructive process. But then fast forward to the picture on the right. I'm sorry, I know your screen is too small, but what I actually found was, over the years, the revival and the flourishing of life that happened after the fire is absolutely as outstanding. So all I find now is continuous emergence of new interactions, new beings, the Barry, the fluzz, sorry, the Barry and the fluzz, the buzz and flurry of life is just exploded. So I thought to myself, why was I so against, or how did I not come to realize that life belongs to death and death belongs to life? And that's the same when it comes to fire and regenerative processes. In order to have an opening, you must have a closing. In order to have life, you must have death. And these things sound obvious, but at the same time, my cultural heritage seems to have endowed me with a very different way of thinking. And instead of understanding that we are, in fact, a supraorganism, as human animals, as mammals, just like with all other species, we are home to literally trillions of symbiotic microbial cells. The interactions are such that we really can't put on one hand, we know that we're all a bounded entity. I'm Emma, I'm talking to you, and you're all listening and hopefully not too bored. At the same time, we recognize that we are interconnected and inseparable from our entire environment. So this both and thinking actually makes a lot of sense, physical sense to me. Now we know that the rhizome is so important that it basically, without it, we couldn't exist. Life as we know it could not evolve or even function, or the ongoing processes couldn't happen without this interconnectivity, at the same time as these sort of individuations, as Deleuze and Guattari would call it, this boundedness. So if we're all a collective of agents and a coherent unity and a part of other emergent unities, then we are complex beings, and we live in a complex, a world of open systems. All right, so what does this mean when we're talking about problems? Well, according to Deleuze and Guattari, arborescence is the dominant way of thinking. Arborescence is a linear, static, fixed mode way of thinking about the world that kind of brackets off the processes and relationships and instead prioritizes parts and wholes. So you might get micro and macro reductionism, where you reduce the entirety down to its parts, or you reduce the parts to their entirety, to their adding up of the whole system. Either way, what you're missing is the organization of the relationship between the part and the whole. Go a step further, and actually complexity suggests that we can't even consider just the whole, because the whole is greater than the whole because of emergent properties, self-organization, and this property of unknown unknowns, this randomness that we've found to exist throughout all systems. Now, if you consider the situation we currently find ourselves in, the reason why Deleuze and Guattari wrote about being tired of trees is because they could see how it was that ways of thinking impact on or co-evolve with or condition or lead to become like a strange attractor, if you like, for the ways that we behave in the world, the way that we view ourselves, our relationship with wider nature, and so on and so forth. And arborescence is a way to contrast to the rhizome. If the rhizome is about being both bounded and open at the same time, if it's about there being continuous interconnectivity. One thing I didn't mention was that with a rhizome, if you break off a rhizome in one place, it starts up again somewhere new. So this is a property of the rhizome as a botanical metaphor, as well as how they actually work in real life. When we talk about arborescence, we get a different way of thinking. When we talk about arborescence, we're talking about a sort of overcoding of thought. And really, if you think about tree, instead of thinking about an actual tree in nature, it's easier to think about arborescence as representing a family tree, a genealogical tree, you know, or, for example, the branching down from top to bottom in terms of hierarchical forms of organization. So you'll get like a CEO of a company, and then beneath that, a branching out to other people with slightly less power and control, and then out again and down to the bottom. But the idea is that it always fixes or separates out, whereas the rhizome is designed to do something different and to show us a different way of thinking altogether. So the notion of arborescence is used as a critical stance against different forms of organization that reflect atomistic or separatist sort of way of thinking. So I'm particularly interested in how this unfolds currently by looking at the economic system as an open system, a human-created system that is a virtual system of ideas that has very real impacts or is actualized. Assembles, to use Deleuzean language, in real life or in ecological reality. So bearing that in mind, it's a politically suffused concept. So how does this arborescence actually look? What do I mean by this? Well, one thing is, I don't know if anyone else has noticed that there's such a strong denial of death. One example would be scientists now trying to stop or reverse aging at the same time that we recognize that population explosion is a major problem on the planet for numerous reasons, even if there were enough resources to go around, which some suggest there are. Endless population growth is obviously a problem. At the same time, we have a culture where we seem to deny death, to push away aging, and to sort of disregard, if you like, the cyclical process. That's one little example. But I want to talk about another one, and that's this idea of the sustainability agenda. So because of our environmental situation we find ourselves in, we have a very strong push and almost universalistic drive towards sustainable development as an agenda in response to that. So from a rhizomatic perspective, the sustainable development agenda is deeply problematic and is arborescent in its thinking. Not necessarily in terms of the intention of the agenda, which if you look into it, I didn't put it on the slide, but the Declaration for Sustainable Development that was signed unanimously, with all of its goals and targets, includes things like eradicating world poverty, gender equality, world peace, food for all, freedom for all. It's really grandiose, and nobody would really disagree with the objectives in the sense that they seem like they take care of the needs of past and present and future generations and our environment, not just humankind. However, Deleuze and Guattari are quick to point out that the map is not the territory. So the world of ideas or thinking is not always translated into how they unfold in practice. And arborescence and the rhizome as a metaphor allow us to contrast what we know about ecological reality or unfoldings or events in terms of being open, interrelational, interconnected systems of continuous process that also form moments of stasis or structure, social structure. And contrasted with the arborescence of this idea of fixed hierarchies, of top-down control. So one example of this, of the map is not the territory, and the issues with this is the financing of the SDGs, the amount of money that's involved, and the new markets that are linked to it. So here I'm sort of drawing attention to the fact that the Sustainable Development Agenda is one that is essentially linked into the notion that the way that we achieve sustainability is through continuous economic growth. Now, continuous economic growth and limitless growth is linked to the idea or the belief that the economic system is a closed system, and that is a form of arborescent thinking that maintains and is propagated or reproduced continuously as a mode of thinking that produces effects on our planet. I don't need to explain to you all here about the issues that we face in terms of the ecological crisis, for example, loss of biodiversity, pollution, toxicity, all these things, even aside from climate change. So we have this attempt to grow a sustainable development finance market, despite the fact that we have trillions of deficit, but we keep going along the same road of thinking about sustainable development being the only way. And this is one example of an arborescent way of thinking. So ecological economics would draw attention to the fact that we've got inappropriate scale, and that inappropriate scale was directly related to the way that the economic system is detached from ecological reality in the way that we think about it. In other words, if you look at the bottom, I don't think you'll see this because it's going to be too small, but the formula for sustainable development looks like what is on the screen, a mathematical equation. It completely externalizes or cannot internalize anything other than quantifiable variables. And along with the hierarchy of sort of the idea of development being a progressive stage from one element, one way of being to another, from underdeveloped to developed to most developed or first, second world, third world countries, you find this kind of narrative, if you like, of linear causality and of linear progress as folding into this notion of arborescence. Excuse me 1 second, I just need to take a sip of water. Okay, sorry. Okay, so I don't want to depress everybody, but one thing that arborescence and the rhizome have done for me is to show me the contradictions of the rhetoric of sustainable development and the growth narrative, as opposed to the territory of life on Earth. So the map is that we will eradicate all poverty, we'll feed everybody, there'll be equality, nobody left behind, inclusivity. Meanwhile, we have an economic system that is debt-based. And the current GDP to debt ratio is actually now above 300%. This is old. I've used an old slide. Global debt is 226 trillion. I think it's up near 300 trillion now. So we have this, we're marching towards this continuous expansion of growth and therefore debt. So debt and growth are correlated in a debt-based system. I would love to explain why, and I can, but I can't do it now. Don't have the time. So needless to say, the sort of dogmatic belief in this system and the inability to reflect on or incorporate complexity and interrelational interdependence, if you like, into our economic and political systems is a major problem. And for that reason, arborescence is a politicized concept that is ontopolitical. So it's an ontology of interrelational interdependence imbued with paradox that also at the same time shows us how arborescent thinking or reductionist thinking is maintaining itself and folding out. That's another example of what I was just talking about. So we're looking at the biggest markets right now, the biggest market instruments. If any of you want to invest money and earn lots of money, you really need to look to the sustainability business. And if you think that's an oxymoron, it is. So currently we have a situation where the way to get out of environmental decline, biodiversity loss, pollution, desertification, loss of forests, you name it, and of course climate change, is by creating more markets. That's the rhetoric. By continuously expanding, if you like, the economic system and therefore the debt-based system. But as ecological economics and other schools like political ecology, post-development, even the decoloniality movement, all of them are linking into this notion of the homogenizing effects that are sort of coming through. And the economic model is just one manifestation of arborescent thinking. There are many. And its current situation, the way it's unfolding now is just one version of what we could look at. So at the same time, we see the loss of biodiversity in the sense that, you know, it's unprecedented. It's actually one of the, you know, major drivers of climate change. It co-evolves with, as well as climate change driving biodiversity loss. Biodiversity loss drives climate change. So the two are not separate, of course. And from a rhizomatic perspective, nor can they be separated. At the same time, we have the loss of culture.
Emma, we
Yeah.
lost you for a few seconds there.
Okay.
Half a minute, maybe just to repeat that.
Sure. Okay. So I'm not sure where you lost me, but the important point is that by looking at the connection between different problems, we can start to see how the same forces that homogenize our planet in terms of loss of biodiversity, habitat loss, and so forth, also homogenize culture. And again, this links into the sort of the problematic of the economic system and the debt-based system, because in order for growth to happen and for new markets to spread, you need economies of scale. So we have a culture industry, we have an attention economy, and of course, these processes of economic globalization and ironically interconnectedness of the economic system at the same time creates this homogenization of culture as part of the effect, if you like, produced. So arborescence, in this instance that I'm using, is a highly contestable way or very damaging way of sort of organizing not only how we interact with wider nature, but how we interact with one another. One of the biggest or most important aspects of arborescence, if you like, biggest is the wrong word, but one of the most central aspects is this notion of hierarchy. Because as soon as you separate out elements or entities or phenomena, then it's very easy to then fall into an ordering sort of situation. So first you separate out in order to understand, and then you land up with sort of an ordering mechanism that sort of flows from that. So it's not necessarily the case from this perspective that there is greedy, evil intentionality going on, but that there is more path dependence or an unfolding of events, whereby hierarchy has become the dominant way of organizing society. And within hierarchy, there are always centers of control and power. And this links, of course, into geopolitics. And here we find intersection with the post-development school, post-humanism, all of the posts, if you like, that attempt to sort of rebound against or react to this. Okay, so one thing I want to talk about is if the rhizome offers us a different ontology, if the rhizome allows us to understand that we are both bounded individual units or individuals, you could say individuations, we are beings, if you like, but we are also simultaneously inseparable from each other, the wider environment, and the impacts and effects going on as open systems. What does that mean? And also, what does it mean when we look at the situation that I've just showed us? I mean, I think some of you here may be familiar with the power that BlackRock currently has. You might be familiar with how the sort of most technophiles, technologically optimistic people in the world with enormous power as part of the fourth industrial revolution have this sort of notion of hacking life. We've got genetically modified organisms, and genetic engineering now moving from plant science, which was already very problematic from many perspectives, and now into the human body, and so on and so forth. So if this situation is unfolding, if you take a rhizomatic perspective, you can't necessarily say that it's how do I put this? It's not the case that it sounds like I'm trying to make the case that everything that we're seeing now is all bad, and that there's major elements wrong with it. And I do have the sensation that we have these major problems that are arising, but really, if you were to take the rhizome seriously, it's not the case that we need to switch from one form of thinking, arborescent, to another, rhizomatic, that embeds complexity and the paradoxes within. It's more a case that we would need to accept that there are rhizomes in trees and trees in rhizomes. So what I mean by that is in terms of the political ontological project of Deleuze and Guattari, and I'll finish up. This is the last two slides. Their ideas have direct implications on my life, which I'd like to share, and they could have implications for other people. But what this metaphor cannot do is prescribe a different way of being, a different way of unfolding. What it can do is draw attention to how things assemble, how they work, and to what effect. So instead of looking at intentionality or ideas about how things should be, like the Sustainable Development Agenda, it would be more of a question of asking, how does it work? When you ask how things work, according to Deleuze and Guattari, every rhizome has lines of stratification, if you like. So every rhizome is territorialized. So every form of process becoming or unfolding has within it knots of structure, if you like, or moments of stasis, where we find social systems. At the same time, every major system, even though it might feel really contracted, like a strong set of organizational principles in a bureaucracy or a top-down global sustainability agenda, within it also has what they would call lines of flight or lines of escape. So it's not the case that there is one or the other, but it's a both and form of thinking. So what does this actually mean? Well, in terms of the micropolitics of subjectivity, for me, both and thinking is so important because what it does is it forces an attitudinal shift. If you tie the notion of the rhizome to complexity science, logically, you land up with like a complexity / ecological rationality. And this rationality suggests that if systems are always both open and bounded at the same time, we have this paradox. In terms of my own life, it folds through into what kind of agency do I have as an individual agent or an individuation, a becoming, a being. So where I live, I've recognized that with the fires that I talked about before, I put out the fires in order to save the plot. I'm living on the plot and planting all these trees in order to try and provide some kind of ecological survival to the area around us. At the same time, what I find is that every time I stop the fire, I'm actually damaging the local ecosystem because it's feinboss and it needs to burn. So I have this agency. I can interact with the land, I can plant trees, or I can put fire out, for example, and save those trees. But I'm also constrained in the sense that in terms of my best intentions, the map is not the territory. So although I want to provide this ecological niche and this awesome ecosystem, really what I'm doing is damaging what needs to be here, which is the feinboss, because I prevent the fire. So I have agency in one way, but I'm constrained in the other. And for me, this is a really important point because, and this I'll finish off with because I know I'm running over because we started late as well. But Rosie Braidotti is a post-humanist, and in relation to talking about this notion of accepting, what does it mean to accept or embed a complexity or a rhizomatic way of thinking into your own world? Because when you consider what I've been talking about, you cannot take the individual like me, for example, my own actions out of the equation. At the same time, you can't divorce my ability to affect, or my vulnerability, my opening is also my ability to be affected. So there are large systems that are way beyond any individual's control, even with the most amount of attempts at predictability and certainty that we find imbued through arborescent thinking. Really, the world is full of emergent properties, self-organization capacities that lead to the notion of unknown unknowns. So on that, to finish, the implications for thinking rhizomatically are deep and long, and I've really rushed through this, and there's so much to be said. But really what's important is an attitudinal shift from assertiveness and an attempt to trying to continuously control and impose, which is hierarchical way of thinking, to one of reflexive experimentation, observing, interacting. So it's a shift, and this has led to transdisciplinary research on the epistemological level in terms of like research methodology. It's lent to post-normal science. And this last thing I'll talk about, which is the provisional imperative, which comes from Minka Woman and the late Paul Cilliers. And from complexity, the ethics of complexity is starting to sort of highlight, and this links with the rhizome, this notion of we know we must act and every action precludes another. But the provisional imperative, it sounds like a paradox and or an oxymoron, and it's deliberately so. And it draws attention to the fact that whilst we can decide on a course of action, we know that anything that we do is only provisional, in the sense that our knowledge is provisional. Our knowledge is completely incomplete. That's a brilliant oxymoron. It is incomplete. There are always unknown unknowns. So in relation to how I interact with the world, trying to think ecologically or think differently and then behave differently to be the people yet to come in the here and now, as Deleuze and Guattari say. How do I live with more gentleness? How do I embed this complex, paradoxical nature of interrelationality into my life? It really involves cracking up in terms of letting go of absolutes, hierarchies, and replacing them with something else. And this is for another time and another talk. I can't go into it now, but for me, it's given me a lot of freedom, because quite paradoxically, to realize that you are vulnerable to affect and to be affected provides an enormous amount of agency, but not in terms of what it is that you intend to do and what will happen, but in terms of recognizing your own capacities, but also knowing that you do not know what will happen or what necessarily is best or better. And within that is a sense of relief and humility that can be agentic. It can allow you to turn negative emotions, like a terrible fear of what's going on, into a little bit more of a radical acceptance for the fact that there's only so much each one of us can do. There's only so much that any organization, any system of ideas can do to change or impose or control things. So I feel like I've skirted across ontology and the politicized nature of micropolitics of subjectivity way too quickly. But I think I must end there, because I know that we're gonna run out of time. So yeah, I'll stop. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Emma. Yeah, a whole lot in there. So I think what we can do, would you mind sort of unsharing your screen, and
Sure
then
thing.
we'll just open the floor up to comments and questions. I think if you want to comment or question, just either use the hand raising function that's there, or if not that, then just yeah, put on your video, and I'll just, you know, direct you to Emma as we go along. So while you are gathering your minds together,
Sorry.
there's a something that's puzzled me a bit, Emma, and that would be, okay, you've got the picture of the fire and then wonderful regeneration at the front of your talk. And my question would be then, would the desire on our part generally, or on kind of supposedly responsible people's part, to actually do something about this so-called crisis that we face, would that actually in a way be a denial of death that we should step away from and avoid, that we should actually accept the cyclical process of degeneration and death, including the death of the species, so that, sure, we die off, we kill ourselves, we age, we contaminate, we get degenerate, we get toxic, we kill ourselves off, we kill a whole lot of other things off, and then, well, the world will carry on. It will regenerate itself, and what does it matter if we die? I don't know, that would just be something that struck me as a reason not to actually bother with all of this stuff.
To not bother with complexity, or to not bother with trying to change anything?
Not bother with trying to change anything, that it's going to happen.
A nihilism.
It's a kind of, not
Almost.
a denialism, but a kind of, yeah, a kind of apathy.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I just came back from a conference in Kruger. I'm aware of the hypocrisies of going to an environmental conference across the other side of the country. And somebody said, I gave a talk about eco grief, and I talked at the end about feeling like the cracking open that Bradelti talks about for me was giving up on the idea that I can control the outcomes. And I talked about the notion of surrender. And this one person said to me that that concerned them because, given all of the problems that we have, it sounds passive. You start falling into really some, I would say, more Buddhist conceptualizations about agency. What should we do? One thing that Deleuze and Guattari talk about is, instead of looking at what we should or shouldn't do or what is right or better, asking ourselves, how does it function? How does it work? And to what effect? So I'm not really going to be able to answer your question because I'm still grappling with it, and I have been for a decade. What I used to do was presume I knew what was best, ecological diversity, planting trees, create a nature corridor, do all this stuff. And then what happened was I was shattered by the fact that I suddenly realized that my attempts to control and although it was well intended, actually has enormous, depending on which scale of magnification you look, is actually deeply problematic. I'm part of the problem. So where I'm at with this, and I can only talk about that, is that I still want to act in the most ecological manner I can. And what does that mean? It means accepting difference. And this is something that I didn't bring into this talk, even though it's absolutely crucial to Deleuze and Guattari, and that's that there is an ontology of difference, in the sense that in order to respect or in any way engage properly with ecological complexity, we have to accept the notion of the other or difference, not just diversity. And difference includes things that we don't like or don't want. So what all of this means, the reason why I use the provisional imperative, what all of this means is, in my own interactions, instead of deciding what it is I want to do and then going full force, I become much more reflexive and learn to still act, but smaller, slower, less assertiveness, more humility, and then learn from the feedback instead of assuming I'm already knowing what the line of causality will be. I know there isn't any. There isn't there is causality, but I can't know it. Okay, so it means a attitudinal shift. It doesn't mean giving up. It just means being much more reflective and reflexive. And what we currently see is assertiveness mixed up with speed, more and more top-down control, grander and grander narratives, larger and larger impacts in terms of organizational ways of doing things. So a top-down approach is the opposite to that. So that's why it frightens me. I don't know. I should probably stop to give that.
I'd like to actually open it up a bit to Roger, who's put some questions in the chat. Roger, do you want to speak to them?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks for what you've said, Emma, especially what you've just said. It's super interesting. And I think what I'm interested in is kind of builds on this, and also how you ended the talk, which is around you've alluded to physical things that you've done that have enabled that reflexivity, has been part of that. This has not just been an exercise of thinking your way into sort of a new way of seeing the world. So I guess I'd like to hear more about other practices that either you have or you know other people have that you found helpful in this space.
Sure,
whether
thank
they're
you.
Physical or other. Yeah,
that's a really interesting point. It came to me through the back door when I was least expecting a visitor. I living the way that I did showed up to me living the way that I do. Because I cook outside and I'm on a solar cooker and I'm in a small home, I'm really engaged with the wider environment, the non-human environment. And so I would say this notion of lived complexity is really important. And the ecotherapists that I use in my thesis talk a lot about how you cannot intellectualize your way into a ecological rationality or complexity way of thinking. You have to experience it directly. And I experienced it directly. And then philosophy helped me comprehend why I was so confused about why I consider myself as a static entity when obviously my crow's feet show me I'm not static, I'm actually aging, you know. Microbiome research shows that actually the brain-gut axis is dictating a lot about how I emotionally respond. So I'm actually a becoming and rather than a being. Why didn't I recognize that? So being in nature, for want of a better word, because I am nature, and of course, some people would say you can be in nature by meditating, and then you go into a different form of a different realm, if you like. But seeing the processes, cycles of life, seeing the absolute incredible diversity and difference. I mean, if I look down on a piece of grass outside, from a distance, it just looks like a few blades of green. But then when I actually look closer, I count 5 or 10 different species. And then if I sit there quietly and just watch and don't think, you have to unthink. You have to stop the thinking mind, according to Deleuze and Guattari, because it's overcoded by semio-capitalism, if you like. So learning to not think is quite paradoxically integral to an ecological perspective. And a lot of people find that hard to grapple with because we're so used to binaries and absolutes. So that's what we're comfortable with. And what we're comfortable with is really important. So I would say, yes, being at the beach and seeing the rhythmic notion of the rhythm of the ocean shows us that there's a cyclical constant, but every wave is different and you could never suggest otherwise. So like being up on a mountain gives you an idea of geological time. So actually removing oneself from human artifacts and human ways of perception that become dominant, I would say, is integral, which leads to modalities like, for some people, meditation, for other people, going on long walks, and so on. Otherwise, complexity science can just be used to hack life. I mean, complexity science is being used right now for AI. So it is no panacea on its own. And it has to be mixed with an ethic, and then getting into the ethics of we don't have time, but yeah, I would say it's about stopping the thinking mind and being exposed to what is, which is not what philosophers necessarily want to hear.
Yeah. And I'm a little concerned about time. So Roger, could we get Francis in quickly, and then we'll go back to your second question, and then I'm afraid that's probably all we're going to have time for.
I'm sorry, that was my fault. Yeah.
Francis, hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Yeah, so, well, actually, coincidentally, I'm kind of speaking a bit to Roger's second point. So I'm doing my master's at the moment and kind of developing a theory of change as being about intensive transformation rather than a linear movement from A to B. So I guess my question is kind of a kind of chicken egg problem. So in the sense that I think there's a kind of fractal self-similarity between how we are psychically organized internally and the way that we think and the way that we have organized the world. So I mean, as a kind of parallel to that very individualistic, atomistic way of thinking. This photo that's become quite famous, taken in Sao Paulo, I think, which is this image of this really fancy block of flats, with each block of flat having its own swimming pool sort of built into it, and this sort of luxury. And then literally directly next door, we've got favelas, like kind of squatter camps, and just kind of can kind of see within that the way that we have instantiated this way of thinking into how we've organized the world. But I suppose then the difficulty for me is, where does change come from and how is it sustained, in the sense that, like, do we start with the inner transformation when the world is corralling us into this atomistic way of thinking, or do we try and reorganize the world in the way that can help us to change how we think? And how does that kind of cyclical maybe process work?
Yeah, it's tricky, hey. I would say, in response to that, and I do not pretend to speak for Deleuze and Guattari, I'm talking for myself now. You come across a lot of the time this notion of heterogeneity and an ethics of alterity, or ethics of otherness, and this all links in. And what it requires is the opposite of top-down centralization and bioregionalism, a mosaic, if you like, of heterogeneity, rather than what we currently have is think global, act local. But really, we're getting top-down policies that are going to impact, coming from the global north, that impact the global south the most. So my gut response is the same as a lot of the social ecologists, political ecologists, ecofeminists, and it's always about, instead of trying to come up with the solution or the framework, it's about creating a situation in which everything has a space. How do you do that when we're already so locked in, so path dependent? I say you've got to radically accept that we can't really undo it. It's unfolding. If we go into the realm of moralizing what's right and wrong, you instantly make static something that I think should be mobile. So ethics is more important to me than morals. Morals universalize, whereas ethics are lived and they are contextualized and relative. So I would suggest we need to move away from centralization and towards decentralization in every degree, to the point of anarchistic tendency. But I know it's not going to happen. And we're path dependent, which is why I said you've got to crack up a bit. It's accepting that. And also having some empathy for the fact that we're all born into this world and these systems. It's so easy to point fingers. I used to have so much hatred for certain key figures, a CEO of this company or CEO of that, and completely neglect the fact that these people are also born into a society that is affecting them as an open system. The mental ecology, the social ecology, and the natural ecology, according to Guattari, they are the three ecologies that interact. So what am I saying? I'm not saying very much. It's not, what I think needs to happen, I don't think will happen. I'm just trying to engage with valuing difference in my own life, which includes challenging my own binaries all the time and my own idea of control. So that's not much of a help, but that's how I'd say. It's all about decentralization. Yeah.
Okay. I hate to say this, but we are even now over the overtime. So
I'm sorry, everyone. That's really poor form.
No, thanks, Emma, and thanks, Roger and Francis, for these really pressing and actually all difficult questions to answer. If they are answerable at all, just bear in mind we will be struggling with this for the entire year, so we haven't come to any kind of conclusions yet. I know Roger will be presenting to us later on in the seminar, and so yeah, it's going to go on. We'll be grappling with this more, and then these questions will come up again and again, and maybe as we go along we will be able to gather together a stronger, I don't know, sense of what we can and can't do. Not sure of that. The idea of the seminar is to feed into a dialogue that will happen towards the end of the year with the Presidential Climate Commission. So stick with us, and help us, I think, grapple with these questions. And And also the seminars will be, they are recorded, as you know. We will upload them to YouTube, and on the invitation for every next one, I will put the links to the previous ones so that you have an idea of where to go to kind of recap if you would like to do that. But for the meantime, I just want to thank Emma again. You've put a whole lot on the table.
Sorry.
And Roger is saying that his second question was quite similar. I did read it, so I actually saw that it was very much in the ballpark of what Francis was asking. So I got the sense that you've responded to it so far, for now, for as much as you can. Yes, so I want to wish you all a very I don't know, productive, I don't know, decadent, whatever, Easter weekend.
An enjoyable weekend, maybe.
An enjoyable, yes, Easter weekend. And we will have a seminar again in 2 weeks' time because of the Easter break. And that will be a seminar, and I'm trying to remember what it's on, I'm afraid, by Bulendlela Nyoni. And it is on, help me, Emma, not eco-grief exactly, but...
Was it to do with vulnerability? I don't know. But you can be forgiven, but the invite will be sent out and all details will be there. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, yes, but something interesting, something on art, something related to that. Apologies for not, I remember now. No regrets thinking. What is that?
Oh, no regrets thinking, yeah.
Yes, all right. So thank you all for joining us, and hopefully see you all in 2 weeks' time. Okay, cheers. Thanks,
Thanks
Emma.
very much. Take care. Bye all.